Today, we're going to talk about some stories about real life cases where people bought cottages for way too much money and now they're kind of stuck with them. I'm going to give you some context of how they got into this situation, tell you the top four reasons why people are having trouble selling their cottages, and then just tell a couple of stories and just give you like a couple of small numbers, but not a lot of them. I'm going to show you here a video. Now, this is a very average lake in Northern Ontario. You won't see any boathouses, you won't see any crazy gigantic mansions of cottages. What you're seeing is mostly waterfront, right? And tucked behind those docks are some very average cottages. Now, what I'm going to tell you is about 20 years ago, this lake was very much a blue collar lake. Most of the people that here, worked in factories, that kind of thing. Cottages were selling on the low end from about 75,000 to the high end of like maybe 175,000 for a lot or for a cottage on that lot. Okay. Fast forward to about 10 years ago, to about 2015, all of a sudden you see a very regular brick cottage. So this is just a regular cottage, sells for $599,000. Now I can tell you that everybody in the lake thought that that was craziness. Then I know somebody who put their heart and soul into building a very nice cottage and it's amazing. They sold it for $750,000. Now, they were kind of in a situation where they didn't really want to sell the cottage. It was kind of heartbreaking, actually. And when I was going by on the dock, I actually overheard the realtor telling them some things that were very inaccurate. The realtor was saying to them, listen, don't worry, you can rent this cottage out to help you meet the ends, or you can Airbnb it. Well, he wasn't really telling them the truth because this entire area has a ban on Airbnb and renting for anything less than 30 days. The fine is actually $25,000. Now, it's not normally enforced. However, if one of your neighbors happens to call you in or you get caught, you will be shut down immediately and then no longer be able to afford your cottage. Fast forward to 2021. Of course, everybody was looking for a cottage. Now, a very modest cottage on the same lake sells for about $1.25 million. Craziness. None of us could believe that anything on this lake would sell for that kind of a price. People move in, they find they don't really like the cottage or they don't really like cottage life, let's say. A couple of years goes by, as you know, cottage prices start to tank. Now, if you take a look really quick at this chart here, you can see the run up in cottage prices over the years. So, you used to be able to get one, we're talking average cottages, not Muskoka mansions. You'd be able to get one for like 400,000. Now you really, look at the increase in cottage prices. We get that huge spike in 2021, and then we get that massive drop. So 2021 was really influenced by obviously COVID, and then really, really low interest rates were giving people the idea that they could carry a much larger mortgage. And here we are a couple years later. Well, poof, look what's happening. Okay, so our cottage that's bought for like the 1.25, now that people find they don't really like being at a cottage anymore. They don't love taking care of two properties. They don't like the extra maintenance. They don't like that when they go to the cottage, they have to do work. So they decide they're going to sell it. It sits on the market. It sits on the market. It sits on the market. Very low interest. What happens? Gets terminated at the end of the summer. Because let's face it, not too many cottages sell in the dead of winter when you can't even see the lake. So you'll also notice that sometimes there's like a cottage market in the fall and the spring. The winter, well, it's really hard to sell a cottage in the winter. Okay, so we talked about that. Now, what's happened Q2 of 2025 with the prices? Well, we have seen an almost 10% drop in the number of units sold, so the volume of cottages in the second quarter of 2025. We're sitting on about 6.9 months of inventory. That is a lot of inventory. So basically that means that this is really and truly a buyer's market. Now, another thing here is that our median price is down about just over 10%. So you're seeing, no, I would have honestly guessed that the price would have dropped even more than that because I would say people were paying two, three, $400,000 too much on $1 million property in 2021. And now, that property is probably worth like 950. Realistically, it could even be like 800. So we were paying like way too much money for these prices. So Seeing on the market statistically only a 10% drop, I honestly don't really think that is that bad. Okay, now we need to also consider one other thing, which is these kind of larger cottages in Muskoka. If you get over in that $2 million range, your $2 million to $10 million, that is a whole different ballgame because people that are generally buying in that price range are not, panicking over interest rates coming up and down just little tiny amounts every day. They're not, renegotiating their mortgages all the time, that kind of thing. Okay, so this kind of average, $1 million cottage market, 500, say, let's say it's 675 to about $1.2 million average cottage market. What has actually happened to cause these prices come down so low? Okay, so we got a couple of things. One is the most obvious thing, which is that we're 5 years past that. People are having to renegotiate their mortgage. They went from having like a 0.5, 1%, 2% mortgage, and now it's a recreational property. They're probably like 5, 6, 7% if they're going with a regular lender, even more if they're with a private lender. Two, they were sold the wrong story. They were told that they can Airbnb the property, they could rent the property. Where a couple things happened there. We've always had these bylaws in place that said you can't Airbnb or rent it in most of cottage areas. And let's face it, the Airbnb market is actually coming down a lot. I personally have, an Airbnb. We've seen a big decrease in the amount of people wanting to Airbnb. And at the same time, we've seen the organization of Airbnb cranking their fees and making it so much more expensive for the hosts and the guests to rent Airbnb. So that's impacting that Airbnb market also. Another thing that's happened is people have found out they just don't like cottage life. They don't understand, or they do now. They didn't understand when they first got into it that they would have to, do all this maintenance, set up their water system, pull their docks in, do all the things that it takes to run a cottage, right? So they're scared there. And the other one is that people can't spend as much time up north or at their cottage as they were thinking they would be able to because all the corporations are making everybody go back to work full time. And some people, they just don't like commuting, or they're finding that they're just not getting the usage out of the cottage that they had before. Now, I feel really bad for anybody that kind of lives in the towns close to the cottage areas because we saw a really crazy run up in the prices of, kind of residential non-waterfront homes at the same time period. Honestly, looking at an area like Parry Sound, paying $800,000 for an average home is quite frankly ridiculous because you do not have anywhere near the employment to support that kind of thing. So we've seen like, the huge pressure in the residential increases. I think those will probably also continue to come down just because we really don't have the employment to hold that. And I just want to mention, kind of one other thing here, and that's that we just don't have the consumer confidence that we had a couple of years ago. If you take a look at what people are saying, the majority of people are saying that their budget is worse than it was a couple of years ago. They do not expect it to get any better, and they really don't feel like it's a good time to invest in a major purchase. So there you have it. That's what's happening with the cottage country. Now, having said that, if you want to buy something, there's some pretty good deals. It really is a buyer's market right now. And if you're a seller, like many of the other markets, you have to have a really well put together package for your property if you want to sell it, or you should just wait this out a little bit. There you have it. My name is Marcy Verberg, and I'm happy to help you with any kind of cottage questions or city questions. I actually spend a lot of time in both areas, so I'm kind of a hybrid. Unlike, I know they always say use only a local realtor, and I think that is very much good advice. Personally, I've spent a lot of time in the cottage area too. So if you have any questions, feel free to reach out. Thanks so much.